Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats.
Hey there, Ryan here. I am super excited to announce that Playing with Power, in partnership with Eminence Gaming, is pleased to bring to you the Mox Masters Tournament Series. This month we will be hosting a 100% proxy-friendly CEDH webcam tournament. The entry is only $30 and there is $2,000 in cash prizes. The top 16 gets double their money back at $60. The top 4 gets $200 and the winner of the tournament gets a cool $500. The tournament is coming up on Saturday, October 22nd, and there will be a cap of 128 players. This tournament is 100% proxy friendly and played in the comfort of your own home over webcam. So be sure to check out the link below and sign up to the tournament today. Good luck, and we hope to see you there.
Tonight, Playing with Power members Alex and Ashani are joined by our Mox Pro patrons Nick and Chad. Some wanted to try out some French brews, and we will see how they do tonight. So, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have Ashani piloting Selvala, Heart of the Wilds. This deck seeks to generate an incredible amount of mana and draw cards quickly in order to storm off and win. Ashani's opening hand contains a Kenrith's Transformation, Emerald Charm, Blossoming Defense, Sylvan Tutor, 2 Forest, and his London Mulligan is a Genesis Wave. Next, we have Nick piloting Jetmir, Nexus of Revels. This is a stacks deck that doesn't go for a combo to win. It instead slowly grinds out the game and wins through attrition. Nick's opening hand contains a Ranger Captain of Eos, Worldly Tutor, Destiny Spinner, Weathered Wayfarer, Mana Confluence, Windswept Heath, and his London Mulligan is a Finale of Devastation. After that we have Alex piloting Tergrid, God of Fright. This is a Pox deck that seeks to disrupt opponents' hands and boards and turn that into advantage for itself. Alex's opening hand contains a Liliana of the Veil, Memory Jar, Soul Ring, Blood Pet, Chrome Mox, Swamp, and a Dothy Voidwalker. Finally, we have Chad piloting Syr Carah the Bold. This is a storm deck seeking to leverage its commander's ability to gain an additional card advantage while storming off. Chad's opening hand contains a Snow-Covered Mountain, Dragon's Rage Channeler, Ancient Tomb, Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, Treasonous Ogre, and his London Mulligans are Command Beacon and a Mountain. Without further ado, let's kick off this haggard, haphazard, happy, handwritten half-and-half handstand. Ashani won the Healthy Sleep Challenge and gets to start us off. Ashani draws a card for turn and plays a Forest. He casts a Sylvan Tutor. He fetches up a Phyrexian Dreadnought onto the top of his library. Ashani passes. Nick draws a card for turn and plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. He casts Worldly Tutor. He fetches up a Phyrexian Revoker onto the top of his library. Nick passes. Alex draws and plays a Swamp. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Dothy Voidwalker. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Felwar Stone. He casts a Blood Pet. Alex ends his turn. Chad draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. He gives the turn to Ashani. Ashani draws and plays a Forest. He passes. Nick draws and plays a Taiga. He casts Phyrexian Revoker. It enters and Nick names Selvala. Nick gives the turn to Alex. Alex draws and casts his commander, Tergrid, God of Fright. Alex ends his turn. Chad draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ashani with Ragavan. Ashani takes it and Ragavan triggers. Chad creates a treasure and Ashani exiles a forest off of the top of his library. In his second main phase, Chad plays an Ancient Tomb. He casts Dragon's Rage Channeler. Chad passes to Ashani. Ashani draws and plays a Forest. He casts his commander, Selvala, Heart of the Wilds. Ashani gives the turn to Nick. Nick draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Destiny Spinner. He casts a Weathered Wayfarer. Nick ends his turn. Alex draws and plays a Mana Vault. He casts Memory Jar. He casts Liliana of the Veil. He activates Liliana's first ability. Each player discards a card, with Nick discarding Ranger Captain of Eos. Tergrid triggers and Alex puts Ranger Captain onto the battlefield. It enters and Alex searches his library, failing to find. Alex sacrifices Ranger Captain, locking out his opponents this turn. Alex sacrifices Memory Jar. Each player exiles their hand and draws 7. Alex casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Blast Zone. He casts a Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Alex moves to his end step and Memory Jar triggers. Each player discards their hand and then returns the exiled cards back to their hand. Tergrid triggers 17 times. Alex returns Fauna Shaman, Drenith Magistrate, Endurance, Finehorn Elves, Marsh Flats, Stomping Ground into play tapped, Temple Garden into play tapped, Arbor Elf, 2 Forests, Jiraga Tree Speaker, Wild Growth attached to a land, Chrome Mox not imprinting, Stormkiln Artist, Lion's Eye Diamond, Crystal Vein, and a Snow-Covered Mountain. Endurance triggers and Chad puts his graveyard onto the bottom of his library. With a huge blowout to the entire table, Alex gives the turn to Chad. Chad draws and taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Treasonous Ogre. He activates Treasonous Ogre, paying 9 life to help cast Valakut Awakening. Channeler triggers and Chad surveils Skullcrack into his graveyard. Then Awakening resolves and Chad puts 1 on bottom and draws 2. Finished up, Chad passes. Ashani draws and casts Kenrith Transformation, targeting Phyrexian Revoker. It enters and Ashani draws. He casts Collector Oof. Ashani gives the turn to Nick. Nick draws and starts off his turn by activating Weathered Wayfarer. He fetches up a Gaia's Cradle into his hand. He plays Gaia's Cradle for turn. Nick gives the turn to Alex. Alex draws and activates Liliana's second ability, targeting Ashani. Ashani sacrifices Collector Oof and Alex chooses not to take it with Tergrid. Next, Alex casts Peer into the Abyss. In response, Chad pays 9 life through Treasonous Ogre to help cast Deflecting Swat. Alex sinks his head and Swat resolves. Chad redirects Peer to himself. Then Peer resolves, Chad draws half of the cards in his library and loses half of his life, rounded up. Next, Alex cracks his Marsh Flats, pays a life, and fetches up a swamp onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Chad with everything. Chad blocks Fauna Shaman with Ogre, Endurance with Channeler, and Stormkiln with Ragavan. Then damage happens, and before the end of combat, Nick channels Iganjo, Seed of the Empire, targeting Treasonous Ogre, killing it. Finished up, Alex ships the turn to Chad. Chad draws and casts a Mox Opal. He plays a City of Traitors for turn. He casts Seething Song, adding 5 red. He casts Underworld Breach. Breach resolves, but Alex reminds him he cannot cast spells from his graveyard due to Drannith Magistrate. So next, Chad casts Molten Psyche. Each player shuffles their hand into their library and then draws that many, with Chad drawing 30 cards. Chad casts Chrome Box, imprinting Comet Storm. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He casts Pyretic Ritual, adding 3 red. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts Jessica's Will, targeting Ashani, adding 4 more red. He casts Grape Shot with all copies targeting Drannith Magistrate, killing it. Now freed up, Chad escapes Seething Song, adding 5 red. He casts Runaway Steamkin. He escapes Seething Song again, adding 5 more red. Steamkin triggers and gets a counter. Chad escapes Valakut Awakening. Steamkin triggers and gets a counter again. Chad puts 20 cards onto the bottom of his library and draws 21. He casts Birgi, God of Storytelling. Steamkin triggers and gets a counter. He removes 3 counters from Steamkin, adding 3 red. He casts a Mana Crypt and adds a red through Birgi. He casts Mox Amber and adds a red through Birgi again. He casts a Lotus Petal and adds another red. He casts a Soul Ring and adds a red. He casts Desperate Ritual, adding a red through Birgi. Steamkin gets another counter, and then he adds 3 more red. He casts Aetherflux Reservoir, adding a red. He casts Gutter Snipe. Steamkin, Birgi, and Aetherflux triggers. He gains life, adds a red, and then puts a counter on Steamkin. Then Gutter Snipe resolves. Chad cracks his Jeweled Lotus, adding 3 red. Tergrid triggers, and Alex puts it onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Syr Carah the Bold. Steamkin, Birgi, and Aetherflux trigger. Chad gains life, adds a red, and then Steamkin gets another counter. Chad removes 3 counters from Steamkin, adding 3 red. He casts Flame Rift. Gutter Snipe, Birgi, Steamkin, and Aetherflux all trigger. Chad gains life, Steamkin gets a counter, Chad adds a red, then Gutter Snipe deals 2 to each opponent. Then each opponent takes 4. Syr Carah triggers, and Chad exiles the top 4 cards of his library. He casts Lava Spike, targeting Alex. Stormkiln, Birgi, Gutter Snipe, and Aetherflux trigger. Chad gains life, Gutter Snipe deals 2 to each opponent, he adds a red through Birgi, and then puts a counter onto Steamkin. Then Alex takes 3 through Lava Spike, and Chad exiles the top card through Syr Carah. Chad casts Rain of Embers. Birgi adds a red, Stormkiln gets a counter, Gutter Snipe deals 2 to each opponent, and then Chad gains life through Aetherflux. Then Rain of Embers deals 1 to each creature and each player. Syr Carah triggers, and Chad exiles the top 4. Chad escapes Grape Shot with all copies targeting Nick. Chad gains life, adds a red, and his opponents get Gutter Sniped. Then Nick takes all the damage and dies. Syr Carah triggers, and Chad exiles the top card. Chad activates Aetherflux, paying 50 life, dealing 50 to Ashani. He pays 50 life to activate Aetherflux again, dealing 50 to Alex, and Chad wins the game. What a cool game. The team brought some more commanders to the table, so let's go again. First, we have Alex piloting Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. This is a Simic Stacks deck looking to cheat huge creatures into play with either its commander or lurking predators. Alex's opening hand contains a Decisive Denial, Mox Opal, Chrome Mox, Flooded Strand, Forest, Soul Ring, and an Astral Dragon. Next, we have Ashani piloting Corvold, Fae-Cursed King. This deck, called Treasure Storm, seeks to resolve Dockside, create a bunch of treasures, and turn that into cards through Corvold. Ashani's opening hand contains a Chain of Smog, City of Brass, Entomb, Wishclaw Talisman, Arid Mesa, Ignoble Hierarch, and a Mayhem Devil. After that, we have Nick bringing back Jetmir, Nexus of Revels. His opening hand contains a Boseiju Who Endures, Kataki War's Wage, Archivist of Ogma, Mother of Runes, Taiga, Flooded Strand, and an Eldritch Evolution. Finally, we have Chad piloting the partner pair of Thrasios Triton Hero and Tevesh Zat, Doom of Fools. This is a Displacer Kitten deck seeking to cast spells and flicker his permanents for an additional advantage. Chad's opening hand contains a Windswept Teeth, Polluted Delta, Flusterstorm, Cyclonic Rift, Windfall, Demonic Consultation, and a Coiling Oracle. And Alex gets to start us off. Alex draws and plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Astral Dragon. He casts Mox Opal. He casts a Soul Ring. Alex passes. Ashani draws and plays a City of Brass. He taps it to help cast Ignoble Hierarch. He passes. Nick draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. Nick ends his turn. Chad draws, plays a Windswept Heath, and passes. Alex draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Breeding Pool onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. Alex gives the turn to Ashani. Ashani draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He taps the City of Brass to help cast Wishclaw Talisman. Ashani ships the turn. Nick draws and plays a Taiga. He casts Kataki, War's Wage. Nick passes. At the end of Nick's turn, Chad cracks his Windswept Heath, pays a life, and fetches up a Zagoth Triumph onto the battlefield tapped. Then Ashani cracks his Arid Mesa, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. The turn moves to Chad. Chad draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He passes. At the end of Chad's turn, Alex activates Kinnan, looking at the top 5 and putting Gilded Drake onto the battlefield. Drake triggers and exchanges control of Ashani's Ignoble Hierarch. The turn moves to Alex. During his upkeep, Alex pays for his artifacts through Kataki. He draws and plays a Snow-Covered Forest. He casts Counterbalance. He moves to combat and attacks Chad with Kinnan. Ignoble Hierarch triggers, giving Kinnan +1/+1. Chad takes it, and Alex ends his turn. During his upkeep, Kataki triggers. In response, Ashani activates Wishclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving it to Chad. He draws and plays a Bayou. He taps the City of Brass to help cast Dockside Extortionist. Counterbalance triggers, Alex reveals Thrasios, Triton Hero, countering Dockside. Ashani ends his turn. Nick draws and plays a Boseiju, who endures. He casts Root Maze. In response, Chad cracks his Flooded Strand. In response, Nick flashes in an Archivist of Ogma. Counterbalance triggers, Alex reveals Thrasios, countering Archivist. Then Chad fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. Then Root Maze resolves. Nick moves to combat and attacks Alex with Kataki. Alex takes it, and Nick gives the turn to Chad. During his upkeep, Wishclaw triggers through Kataki. In response, Chad activates Wishclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Wishclaw to Nick. He draws, takes no other actions, and passes the turn. At the end of Chad's turn, Alex activates Kinnan, looking at the top 5 and putting Thrasios, Triton Hero, onto the battlefield. Then Chad discards to hand size, and the turn moves to Alex. During his upkeep, Alex pays for his artifacts through Kataki. He draws and plays a Homeward Path, and to play tap through Root Maze. He moves to combat and attacks Nick with Kinnan. Hierarch triggers, and Kinnan gets +1/+1. Nick takes it, and Alex sends the turn over to Ashani. Ashani draws, takes no actions, and passes. During Nick's upkeep, Wishclaw triggers through Kataki. In response, Nick activates Wishclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Wishclaw to Ashani. He draws and casts Collector Roof. This is a problem for Alex, and Counterbalance triggers. Alex reveals a Mox Amber, and with Oof still in the stack, Alex activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5 and fails to find. Then Collector Oof resolves. Nick moves to combat and attacks Chad with Kataki. Chad takes it, and Nick passes the turn. At the end of Nick's turn, Chad casts Nature's Claim, targeting Root Maze. Counterbalance triggers, Alex reveals a Swan Song, countering Nature's Claim. The turn moves to Chad. Chad draws and plays an island into play tap through Root Maze. He passes. At the end of Chad's turn, Alex casts Decisive Denial, targeting his own Kinnan and Collector Oof. In response, Chad casts Flusterstorm, with all copies targeting Decisive Denial. Denial is countered, and the turn moves to Alex. During his upkeep, Alex sacrifices his artifacts through Kataki. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Chad with Kinnan. Hierarch triggers, giving Kinnan +1/+1. Chad takes it, and Alex passes the turn. During his upkeep, Ashani sacrifices his Wishclaw through Kataki. He draws and casts Birds of Paradise. Ashani ends his turn. Nick draws and plays a Brushland into play tapped. He casts Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. Counterbalance triggers, Alex reveals Finale of Devastation, countering Thalia. Nick moves to combat and attacks Chad with Kataki and Collector Oof. Chad takes it, and Nick ends his turn. At the end of Nick's turn, Chad casts March of Swirling Mist, exiling a blue card targeting Kinnan and Thrasios. Counterbalance triggers, and in response, Alex activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing Finale of Devastation into his hand. Alex reveals a Carpet of Flowers through Counterbalance. Then both creatures phase out, and the turn moves to Chad. Chad draws and casts Trinket Mage. It enters, and Chad fetches up a Lotus Petal into his hand. He casts Lotus Petal. It resolves and enters tap through Root Maze. Chad sends the turn to Alex. Alex creatures phase in. He draws and casts Carpet of Flowers. He moves to combat and attacks Nick with Kinnan. Hierarch triggers, and Kinnan gets +1/+1. Nick takes it, and in his second main phase, Alex adds 3 blue through his carpet. He activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5 and puts Finehorn Elves onto the battlefield. Alex passes the turn. Ashani draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire into play tapped. He taps his City of Brass to help cast Mayhem Devil. Counterbalance triggers, and Alex reveals an Arcane Signet. Mayhem Devil enters, and Ashani follows it up with a Mox Opal into play tapped. Ashani ends his turn. Nick draws and casts Winota, Joiner of Forces. He moves to combat and attacks Chad with Kataki. Winota triggers, Nick looks at the top 6 and puts Ranger Captain Avios onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Alex. Ranger Captain triggers and Nick fetches up a Syr Ascendant into his hand. Then Chad blocks Kataki with Trinket Mage and they take the rest. All through, Nick passes. Chad draws and casts Mystic Remora. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. Chad ends his turn. Alex draws and in his first main phase he has 3 blue through his carpet. He casts Finale of Devastation where X equals 5. Remora triggers and Chad draws. He fetches up a Seedborn Muse onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Chad with Kinnan. Hierarch triggers and Kinnan gets +1/+1. Chad takes it and Alex passes to Ashani. Alex untaps with Ashani through Seedborn. Ashani draws, takes no actions, and passes. At the end of Ashani's turn, Alex activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5 and puts Jin-Jitaxis, Progress Tyrant, onto the battlefield. Still in the instep, Ashani cracks his Bloodstained Mire and pays a life. Mayhem Devil triggers and kills Ignoble Hierarch. He fetches up a Stomping Ground onto the battlefield tapped. Then Nick sacrifices Ranger Captain Avios to get another Mayhem Devil trigger. Devil triggers and Ashani targets Finehorn Elves. In response, Ashani taps the City of Brass to cast Necromancy. Remora triggers and Chad draws. Counterbalance triggers and Alex reveals a snow-covered island. With Devil still in the stack, Alex casts Swan Song, targeting Necromancy. Jin-Jitaxis triggers, copying Swan Song, targeting Necromancy as well. Remora triggers and Chad draws. Necromancy is countered, Ashani creates a 2/2 bird, Finehorn Elves dies, and Ranger Captain's ability resolves. Finally through, the turn moves to Nick. Alex untaps with Nick through Seedborn. Nick draws and plays a Horizon Canopy into play tapped. He casts Syr Ascendant. He moves to combat and attacks Chad with Collector Oof. Winota triggers, Nick looks at the top 6 and fails to find. Then Chad takes it and Nick gives the turn to Chad. At the end of Nick's turn, Alex activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a snow-covered island onto the battlefield tapped. Alex untaps with Chad through Seedborn. During his upkeep, Chad sacrifices his Remora. Mayhem Devil triggers and deals 1 to Nick. Chad draws and casts a Soul Ring. Jin-Jitaxis triggers and counters Soul Ring. Next, Chad casts Baleful Strix. It enters and Chad draws. Chad passes. At the end of Chad's turn, Alex activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a snow-covered island onto the battlefield tapped. Still in the instep, Alex activates Homeward Path, gaining control of his Gilded Drake. Alex draws and in his first main phase he has 3 blue through his carpet. He casts Void Winnower. The table sinks as Void Winnower resolves. Alex moves to combat and attacks Chad with everything. Chad takes it all and Alex ends his turn. Alex untaps with Ashani through Seedborn. Ashani draws and plays an Overgrown Tomb into play tapped. He taps the City of Brass to help cast his commander, Corval, Fae-Cursed King. It enters, triggers, and Ashani sacrifices Mox Opal. Corval triggers, gets a counter, and Ashani draws. Mayhem Devil triggers and deals 1 to Nick. Ashani ships the turn. At the end of Ashani's turn, Alex activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a forest onto the battlefield. Alex untaps with Nick through Seedborn. Nick draws and moves to combat. He attacks Chad with Syr Ascendant and Collector Oof. Winota triggers, Nick looks at the top 6 and puts Destiny Spinner onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Chad. Chad takes it, dies, and Nick gains 6 life. All through, Nick passes. At the end of Nick's turn, Alex activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5 and puts Consecrated Sphinx onto the battlefield. Alex draws and moves to combat. He attacks Nick with everything. Nick takes it, and in his second main phase, Alex casts Arcane Signet. Jin-Jitaxis triggers, and Alex copies it. Both enter tapped through Root Maze. Next, Alex casts Mox Amber. He activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Crop Rotation into his hand. He casts Crop Rotation, sacrificing a land. Mayhem Devil triggers and deals 1 to Kinnan. Then Alex fetches up a Gaia's Cradle onto the battlefield. Alex attempts to pass, but in response, Nick sacrifices his Horizon Canopy. Mayhem Devil triggers and deals 1 to Kinnan, killing it. Then Nick draws a card. Consecrated Sphinx triggers and Alex draws 2. With nothing else, the turn moves to Ashani. Alex untaps with Ashani through Seedborn. Ashani draws and Alex draws 2 through Consphinx. He does nothing else and passes. At the end of Ashani's turn, Alex flashes in, a Hullbreaker Horror. Nick draws and Alex draws 2 through Consphinx. He moves to combat and, in response, Alex pays 2 life to help cast Noxious Revival, targeting Crop Rotation in his graveyard. Jin-Jitaxis and Hullbreaker trigger. Alex bounces Winota to Nick's hand and then copies Noxious, again targeting Crop Rotation. Crop Rotation is put on top of Alex's library. In Nick's second main phase, he casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Collector Oof as an additional cost. Jin-Jitaxis triggers, but Nick points out that he has a Destiny Spinner on the battlefield. Unfortunately, he misread the card because it only makes creatures and enchantments uncounterable. Nick groans and Jin-Jitaxis counters Eldritch Evolution. A very dismayed Nick passes the turn. At the end of Nick's turn, Alex activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Crop Rotation into his hand. He activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Mystical Tutor in his hand. He casts Mystical Tutor. Hullbreaker triggers and bounces Mayhem Devil. He then fetches up a Brainstorm onto the top of his library. He activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Brainstorm into his hand. He casts Brainstorm. Hullbreaker triggers and targets Corvold. In response, Ashani casts Dark Ritual. Counterbalance triggers and Alex reveals a lurking predators. Then Ashani adds 3 black. He casts Entomb. He fetches up an Elves of Deep Shadow into his graveyard. He then casts Veil of Summer. It resolves and Ashani draws. Consecrated Sphinx triggers and Alex draws 2. With the bounce trigger still on the stack, Ashani casts Ad Nauseam. Counterbalance triggers and Alex reveals a Reclamation Sage. Still in response, Alex casts Crop Rotation, sacrificing a forest. Hullbreaker triggers and bounces Adnaz back to Ashani's hand. Then Crop Rotation resolves and Alex fetches up an Emergence Zone onto the battlefield. Then Corvold bounces and Alex's Brainstorm finally resolves. Alex draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. The turn moves to Alex. Alex draws and casts Court of Calling where X equals 6. Ginge attacks his triggers and Alex copies it. He fetches up a Thassa's Oracle onto the battlefield. Thoracle enters and Alex looks at the top 10 and puts all of them on bottom. Then Alex fetches up a Deadeye Navigator onto the battlefield. It enters and soul bonds to Thassa's Oracle. Alex casts Mana Crypt. Hullbreaker triggers, bouncing Mox Amber. Then Mana Crypt enters tapped. He casts Mox Amber. Hullbreaker triggers and he bounces Root Maze. He casts Scroll Rack. Hullbreaker triggers and he bounces Mana Crypt. Alex presents a loop of casting Mana Crypt and Mox Amber, tapping them for mana, and then bouncing them through Hullbreaker. He nets infinite mana. He activates Thrasios, drawing his deck and putting all of his lands onto the battlefield. He activates Deadeye's ability, flickering Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Alex wins the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what a crazy set of games tonight. Congrats to Chad and Alex on their wins. In Game 1, Alex was way ahead on board. Chad had the exact card he needed to steal Alex's Pier, and therefore steal the win from Alex. In Game 2, Alex snowballed out of control. The stacks on the table was backbreaking to his opponents. His counterbalance helped swing the game in his favor so he could pull out ahead. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more like this, be sure to subscribe. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time when we duke it out to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.